The Shaping of Gondor, Part 1. The Birth of Gondor. Chapter 4. Rebellion. With the death of Isildur and his elder sons, and a youngling of 13 upon the throne of Arnor, Meneldil was left supreme in his authority over Gondor. A formidable number of challenges confronted him. Mordor was defeated, true enough, but thousands of orcs, Southrons, and Eastern men, the remnants of Sauron's shattered armies, still continued to assail and harass the realm's borders, sometimes penetrating nearly to the lands of the royal ward. The material demands and conscriptions of war had depleted the fields of farmhands, and the cities of artisans and skilled laborers. The roads and ways of the provinces were in an appalling state of disrepair and decay. The walls of Osgiliath itself were half demolished from a 5-year siege. Thousands of farms and plantations had been left ravaged by Sauron's minions, further weakening the Stoneland's foundation of strength. Court finances were in chaos. Altogether, for all that it had been a victory, the War of the Last Alliance had brought Gondor nearly to the brink of ruin. Meneldil, unlike his father and uncle, had little talent or taste for war, nor did he cut an impressive figure. Slender, gangling, and awkward, he was to some degree the weakling of the family, and could only ever manage a straggling red beard. And although he, like the rest of his kin, had labored furiously to commandeer arms and supplies for the war against Sauron, it had all been from the relative safety of Osgiliath and the provinces. Unlike his elder brothers, he never once swung a sword in defense of the Stoneland. He had a sharp mind, however, and once upon the throne, he addressed himself to the situation with determination and ability. First, he intended to put the treasury in order. Many of the lords of the great fiefs owed considerable sums of money to the crown, most of which dated back decades or more to the reign of the Diarchy. Meneldil therefore now demanded repayment of these debts from the delinquent lords. He intended to finance the reconstruction of the king's public edifices from these remittances. In addition, taxes were slightly increased on the trading of certain goods and luxuries, such as silk, gold, and leather. Here, alas, Meneldil attempted too much too quickly. The Crondirs had been willing to concede to Isildur's and Anarion's call for arms, monies, and supplies out of sheer awe of their personalities and the exigencies of war, but to the less accomplished and impressive Meneldil they would not. 12 hard years of war had drained the provincial treasuries dry as it was. The debts were old, and for the lords to have paid them would have rendered them utterly insolvent. The Lord of Lebanon, Gondres, was particularly vocal in his refusal to cooperate, and in the year 5 of the Third Age expelled the assessors that the king had sent from Osgiliath to gather the money. When Meneldil sent a detachment of soldiers to bring Pelargir to heel, they were met with a swarm of arrows and spears, and promptly sent packing. Uthien, the lord of neighboring Belfalas, then joined with Gondres in defiance of the crown, scenting the opportunity to escape from onerous taxation in the air. His instinct seemed proven right when a larger force deployed by Meneldil to sort things out betrayed their king and deserted to the rebellious lords. The site of the desertion came to be known as the Plain of Deceit forevermore thereafter. Meneldil might have been wise at this point to have backtracked and sought some understanding with his lords, but bitterly stung by the latter's betrayal of what he perceived of as their oath of loyalty to the kingdom that his father, uncle, and grandfather had died so recently to defend, he would not. Although he made no further attempt to push the matter by force, neither did he retreat 1 inch legally from his position. By defying his edicts, he maintained, the Crondirs were in violation of their oaths. He flatly declared Uthien and Gondres to be traitors and renegades to the realm, and their tenants freed of all obligation to obey them. This merely served to stoke the conflict further, however. Taking counsel together, the two lords decided to preempt further royal displays of force by taking the fight to Osgiliath and driving the point home that Meneldil was no warrior, and that it was the lords who would dictate terms, and not the king. Better to strike the lion cub in his den before he comes out into the wild to feed, Gondris is supposed to have said. This was grave indeed. Belfalas and Lebanon were the two richest and most populous provinces in the kingdom, and together they were more than capable of resisting the far less populated and developed royal ward. In 7, then, Gondris and Uthien marched a rebel force of some 6,000 spears to the walls of Osgiliath, and began what is usually known in the histories as the Long Rebellion, so named for its exceptional length and viciousness. Taken by surprise, what few soldiers were in and around the city were swiftly routed, and forced to retreat within the walls to make a stand of it, and for the second time in less than 20 years the city was placed under siege. Meneldil himself happened to be in Osgiliath at the time, and although he did what he could to rally the capital's defense, the true mainstay of the defending spirit was a certain Tarkiel, a captain who had fought under Isildur and Anarion with no special distinction during the War of the Last Alliance. Tarkiel had risen slowly through the ranks, and was by now the chief of the White Guard. With the rebel siege, however, he now took his place in history, and oversaw the defense of the city with extraordinary force and ability. Meneldil, for his part, managed to avail himself of a secret underground egress, and left the capital after about a month, turning over its maintenance to Tarkiel, an act which brought him scorn from many at the time, who saw such a slippery getaway as an act of desertion. He then proceeded to make his way north into Anorion with a few followers, and set up residence in Kir Amon, some 50 miles west of Minas Anor. As the year 7 closed, then, Meneldil's reign seemed destined to end in disaster. Only 5 years after having assumed the throne, he had lost control of his two greatest provinces, and had been driven out of his capital, and was now a refugee in his own realm. Yet, it seems the experience had a sobering effect on him. It would be no more underestimation of his enemy's strengths. He had erred for the last time, and from then on he acted with the determination and perceptiveness that would in time gain him the nickname Meneldil the Well-Aware. The king needed soldiers, firstly, and losing no time in rallying his subjects in the places of the lands that were still loyal to him, had soon amassed a force of fair size in Kir Amon. He judged it too small to be sure of victory against the Lord's army, however, and requests were sent beyond the Seven Heartlands for aid. Loranand, Khazad-dûm, Imladris, and many other minor lords of Eriador responded with promises, but nothing else. Meneldil's young nephew and Arnor, King Valandil, also pledged to come to his uncle's aid, but not having yet come into his majority, could do little at the moment. So, for 7 years, Meneldil was forced to bide his time. There is an alternative account of this story, in which Meneldil supposedly traveled to Arnor in person to make his plea for assistance to young King Valandil, but this is almost certainly not so. Meneldil was an exceedingly proud man, and would not so lightly have suffered such an indignity. He did what he could in the meantime, to be sure. Although formidable, the rebel army was not sufficient to encircle the whole of Osgiliath at all times, and Meneldil was able to sneak arms and supplies in here and there. The garrisons of Minas Anor and Minas Ithil likewise remained loyal to the crown, but they remained cut off from one another on either side of the valley of Pelennor, and neither proved able to break the besieging force alone. Nor could they move north to join with the king, for to do so would have left both fortresses dangerously vulnerable to rebel attack. So, for the moment, all the king could do was wait. Eventually, in the spring of 14, Valandil finally came through and sent a sizable army marching south. After joining with Meneldil's force in Kir Amon, the combined armies marched southward, with the king leading troops into battle for the first and last time in his life. Swooping down upon Osgiliath in a lightning-fast advance, the royals routed the rebel besiegers in a matter of minutes, and pursued them down the Anduin into Lebanon. After 7 years, the capital was liberated once more. After a ceremony of thanks before the Valar, Meneldil relocated to Minas Anor and placed Tarkiel in command of the royal armies. Tarkiel's strategy was twofold: to confront the rebel lords' armies in the field where the ground was favorable, and starve them of supplies by burning and confiscating the lands and estates of all who resisted the royal banners. It was a slow, cruel approach, but also an effective one, and year by year Tarkiel's forces bit into rebel territory in Lebanon, and in a series of small battles and skirmishes too numerous to record individually. In the winter of 27, near the town of Ravenspur, the rebel captains attempted to outflank and crush Tarkiel in a surprise attack, while the royal soldiers were encamped in winter quarters. Things went well for the rebels until, in a rush of excitement, Gondrus, lord of Lebanon, charged pell-mell into the thicket of the fighting, only to be surrounded, unhorsed, and killed. With their commander dead, the remainder of the army quickly dissolved into chaos, and Tarkiel ended up with a complete surprise victory. Uthien of Belfalas now assumed sole leadership of the rebellion. Unlike Gondrus, he preferred to make clever use of the terrain, and of feints in the field as opposed to all-out charges, and with this approach did much to hinder Tarkiel's advance through the upper Lebanon. In 29, at Forminelos, about 100 miles north of Pelargir, he nearly succeeded in reversing the decision of Ravenspur, when a traitor named Morgai revealed the location of Tarkiel's troops. Unfortunately, the rebel lord decided to wait until dawn to attack, and by then Tarkiel had been made aware of the leaked information and had taken countermeasures. The ensuing battle ended in a stalemate, with both sides leaving the field with considerable losses. The conflict wore on uncertainly after this for some years, with the two sides circling and evading the other. Both, de both determined not to allow the other an advantage. In 34, the two clashed at Gellen's Ford, and then again in 37 at Escalas. At the second battle, Uthien was completely defeated by means of an ingenious feint on Tarkiel's part, and after that there was no further organized resistance in Lebanon. Uthien withdrew what remained of his soldiers to Belfalas, while Tarkiel advanced unopposed towards Pelargir. The city resisted stubbornly as always, but Tarkiel had her blockaded by both sea and land, and in 40 she gave up, and by 43 all of Lebanon was restored to royal authority. After allowing about a year for consolidating the newly reconquered fief, Tarkiel began the thrust into Belfalas. The Belfalasi were stout fighters, to be sure, and Uthien continued to fight ably, but it was no use. With the men and resources of Lebanon behind it, the royal army swelled in numbers with every passing season, as more and more towns and districts were scooped up by royal forces. In 47, the fiefs of Amphalas and Lamdun, which had until then maintained an ambivalent neutrality in the conflict, contributed a number of warriors to the royal banner. Then in 49, Uthien fell victim to a conspiracy among his officers, and they murdered him in Dimbar, and that accelerated the unraveling of the provincial resistance further, for it deprived the lords of their most skilled commander. In 54, with defeat looming, the Belfalasi made one last attempt to revive the failing rebellion, by placing a large force of 5,000 men under one Herukalmo. Tracing a wide arc through northern Belfalas and Lebanon, Herukalmo attempted to circumvent the royal army and entrap them from behind in a surprise stroke. It was a daring move, but once again fate intervened when the captain's jealous mistress Vilmiu betrayed her lover to Tarkiel's scouts. Tarkiel lost no time in maneuvering Herukalmo into a cul-de-sac in the Vale of Tumladen, and there crushed him utterly. Herukalmo, along with about 4,000 others, were subsequently taken prisoner. With that, there was nothing for the Belfalasi lords to do but capitulate, and in August of 54 Tarkiel marched triumphantly into Dol Mirathas. After nearly half a century of bitter and unnecessary fighting, the king and Osgiliath ruled Gondor from end to end. The long rebellion was at last over.